Good evening, everybody. I am John O'Loughlin, and welcome to my channel. It's called McDuff_2020. And tonight I am continuing my reading of selections from the book War Against the Weak by Edwin Black. And it is kind of a dark subject we are on tonight. Just as a brief reminder, we had been reading this chapter called Hitler's Eugenic Reich. And good evening, everybody. I am John O'Loughlin. And we're about halfway through the chapter. What we're noticing is that it's not just a Hitler project. This has got IBM involved. It's got the Rockefeller Foundation all over it, and this Kaiser Wilhelm Institutes that are financed by Rockefeller and our friend Carnegie. So this whole eugenics project is now getting organized in Nazi Germany. And who is helping to organize it? Well, of course, IBM, International Business Machines. And we left off with the sentence, mass eugenics required efficient systems. IBM was willing. So we carry on from here. How's everybody doing? Chocolate pie. I had chocolate pie tonight, and I had 2 pieces, and I don't know. It's a lot. It's very, very intense and sweet. So, but I'll be fine. I'm just going to ignore it. It was delicious. Hey, Kathy Sue, how are you? Happy holidays. Think of you out there in San Diego, basking in the sun. Yeah, living that wild California life. Yeah. You're a California girl? Yeah, easy on the chocolate is good advice. It's delicious, but you gotta have limits. Hey, David, I did too. I think that was a blast, and Addie really he holds his own with George, doesn't he? He's like, uh, I think it's terrific, and I enjoyed it. Well, let's keep on reading and see where this tale of horror leads. We're on page 290 of the book. IBM managers desired the lucrative ERO account. I'll remind you, ERO is the Eugenics Record Office at Cold Spring Harbor on Long Island in New York, right there where the Carnegie Institute is. And all of that elite money around Cold Spring Harbor. So that's the Eugenics Record Office. And if you remember, that was financed by the Harriman family. And Clyde and was Davenport. I can't remember his first name, but Davenport is the man who cajoled the money out of the Harrimans and the Carnegies to make this project, the Eugenics Record Office at Cold Spring Harbor. IBM managers desired the lucrative ERO account, but the process of punching in the hundreds of thousands of existing index cards at Cold Spring Harbor was simply too massive and expensive an undertaking. But if brought into a project at the outset, IBM could cost-effectively tabulate all names, racial information, medical characteristics, and other eugenic data. This required IBM engineers to confer with Davenport's eugenic investigators to jointly plan the program, ensuring that data was collected in a fashion that could be systematically coded and punched into holorith machines for later retrieval and management. To design the system correctly, the IBM engineers needed to know both the eugenic information that Carnegie researchers wanted to input, as well as how they wanted the results retrieved. IBM also needed to know the end result in order to design the system. In a report on the Jamaica project, Davenport confirmed, quote, the test records were scored as received, chiefly by Miss Bertha Jacobson. Codes for each of the traits to be tabulated were worked out, adapted to the holorith punch cards. Ratios were computed. IBM custom designed the layout for at least 45 variables to be punched in on the Jamaica project for later retrieval by eugenicists. Sex and race were to be punched into column 1, age in column 2, height in columns 3 and 4, cranial capacity in column 18, foot length in column 24, Army Alpha Intelligence testing in column 33, and beta testing, pardon me, well, that one snuck up on me, pardon me, and beta testing in column 32. Information on fingerprints was punched into columns 44 and 45. At one point, Davenport considered securing data from banks about how much money was in each individual's account and cross-referencing this information against eugenic standards. The 1927-28 Jamaica race crossing investigation was the first time IBM devised a system to track and report racial characteristics. 5 years later, IBM, under the leadership of its president, Thomas J. Watson, would adapt the same technology to automate the race warfare and Jewish persecution in Hitler's Reich. IBM custom designed the indispensable systems that located European Jews and other undesirables, and then provided a multiplicity of custom-tailored punch card programs to help the Nazis trace family trees, index bank accounts and other property, organize eugenic campaigns, and even manage extermination in death camps. Indeed, a decade later, the SS Race Office employed a punch card with physical attributes specified column by column in a fashion almost identical to those first worked out for the Jamaica study. The pilot investigation in Jamaica went well, so well that the Carnegie Institution proudly published a major research volume on the project. Even as the program was underway, in February of 1927, Davenport was confident enough to contact Fisher in Germany and discuss ideas with him. "No one has greater experience in the field than you," wrote Davenport, "and we shall of course want to get the benefit of that experience." A few days later, he notified the IFEO secretary in London that a race-crossing committee would be needed, quote, in view of the international nature of the problem. In short order, Fisher was invited to join the committee, Davenport would chair the panel. The campaign to identify mixed-race people of all varieties across America began on November 14, 1928, with one of the ERO's well-honed, massive letter-writing efforts. Beginning that day, scores of letters were mailed by Davenport to eugenic contacts at universities, prisons, agricultural colleges, as well as to members of the American Breeders Association and other interested parties in every state from California to Florida and even the Alaska Territory. It was the first step in searching out the racially unacceptable. Davenport's letters were all variations on a few forms. Quote, "The IFEO is making a survey of the points of contact of dissimilar human races in different parts of the world. In carrying out this program, may I call upon you for some assistance? We should be glad if you would inform us if there are areas where widely different races of mankind have recently begun to come into contact in your state. By races, we have in mind not only primary races like white, Negro, Indian, and Orientals, but also very dissimilar European races. Especially important would be localities where the first and second hybrid generations can be secured in considerable numbers." A letter went to sociologist Raymond Bellamy at the Florida State College for Women. Bellamy replied, quote, "I am glad to do anything I can to help," and specified Negroes and Seminole Indians in South Florida and Cubans in Tampa. A copy went to W.E. Bryan, a plant breeder at the University of Arizona in Tucson. Bryan reported race mixing between American Indians and Mexicans and suggested using a field worker who could speak Spanish. A letter went to J.S. Blitch, superintendent of the Florida State Reformatory. Blitch responded that of his 1,640 prisoners, fewer than a third were white, the rest being, quote, "plain Negro stock," unquote. UCLA official Bennett Allen replied that Los Angeles was home to many ethnic groups, including Japanese, Mexican, Italian, and Portuguese. He also reported that the Mexicans and the Japanese rarely married outside their respective groups. Henry Bowley of the North Dakota Agricultural College's Botany Department reported, quote, "half-breeds among our North Dakota Indians, but I think largely of French origin, as well as farmers of Russian and possibly Polish heritage." On February 29, 1929, Davenport went global. He mass-mailed letters to eugenic contacts and official sources in countries on every continent, signing them as president of the IFEO's Committee on Race Crossing. The letters all declared, quote, "The Committee on Race Crossing of the Federation is seeking to plot the lines or areas where race crossing between dissimilar, more or less pure races is now occurring, or has been occurring during the last 2 generations. The committee would appreciate very much your assistance. We should be glad to have a statement from you as to the location in your country or the principal regions of such race crossing, the races involved. For example, European and Negro, European and Amerindian, Chinese, Malay, North European, and Mediterranean, together with a number of generations during which the hybridization has been going on a significant scale. In Norway, Dr. Halfdan Bryn focused on, quote, "the northern parts of the country where, over the centuries, Laplanders and Alpines had mixed with pure Nordics." Bryn added that in his forthcoming book, to be published by Lehman in Munich, would include plenty of pictures, quote, "of Norwegian hybrids." In Moscow, Professor Bunak, director of the Institute of Anthropology, explained that the Eastern European plains, the Caucasus, Siberia, and Turkestan all featured numerous tribes, such as North European, Baltic, Mediterranean, Armenoid, Uralian, Mongolic, Turk, and others who had intermingled during the past 20 to 30 centuries. More recently, Yakutian Russians and other race hybrids had proliferated through the regions. In colonial Rhodesia, a museum zoologist acknowledged some Bantu and Asiatic mixtures, but he assured Davenport that miscegenation is regarded by decent persons as severely as it probably is in the southern states of the USA. Reports came from Brazil, China, Holland, France, Fiji, Chile, and many more countries. In locations with no known eugenic contacts, Davenport resorted to Lauchlin's network of American consuls. In the Azores, Vice Consul Prescott Childs demonstrated an excellent knowledge of eugenic principles and reported that due to the island's remoteness, very few of Breton or Flemish blood had mixed with pure Portuguese. Childs added that his real eugenic concern was too much intermarriage, which he believes led to increased insanity. In Harbin, American Consul C.C. Hansen pointed out that a number of Russians had migrated into North Manchuria, resulting in intermingling of Chinese men with Russian women. Hansen reported the villages along various rivers where half-caste children of the first generation could be located. In Nairobi, American Consul Charles Albrecht outlined the geographic districts of Kenya and attached a list of photographers who might be able to furnish you with photographs of race hybrids. In Estonia, Tahiti, and other remote locations, American consuls pledged their assistance. At 6:15 p.m. on Friday, February 27, 1929, the International Federation of Eugenic Organizations met in Rome to consider the preliminary report of the Committee on Race Crossing. From their perspective, identification and eugenic countermeasures of all sorts were more than pressing. The world was in crisis, and they were in a race against time. Mussolini, a dictator, was not hampered by the checks and balances of democracy. The IFEO wanted to enlist him to help impose stern eugenic measures in Italy. Since the summer, Fisher and Davenport had been working on a special appeal to Il Duce. Now, in the Piazza Venezia, they and their colleagues would have an audience with Mussolini. Fisher stepped forward to read the long appeal. It was not lost on the delegation that they were in Rome, seat of the Catholic Church, which strenuously opposed all forms of eugenics. It seems natural and desirable, Fisher read, when considering eugenic problems, that some expression of our hopes and wishes should be addressed to the great statesman, who shows more than any other leader today how much he has the eugenic problems of his people at heart. Fisher went on to label the effects of race mixing catastrophes and urged immediate measures to set a model to the world by showing that energetic administration can make good the damage. In an emotional crescendo to his appeal, Fisher declared, "The urgency brooks no delay. The danger is imminent." 2 hours later, the men retreated to the elegant library of the Central Statistical Institute, where they huddled over maps, reports, tables, and surveys as they plotted the course of their global eugenic action. Virginia, the Java Islands, Norway, Germany, all of Europe, all of the United States, all of the British Empire, the world, with trained field workers and Hollerith data processing equipment, the unfit could be quickly and methodically identified, quantified, qualified, and prioritized for countermeasures, whether they resided in big cities, the hinterlands, or island villages. Every delegate was instructed to lobby his government for cooperation. Davenport was encouraged. Fascism was on the rise in Europe, and he realized it was time to relinquish the reins. On December the 2nd, 1929, Davenport wrote to Fisher asking him to assume chairmanship of the Committee on Race Crossing. Rudin would soon replace Davenport as IFEO president as well. The Germans were the future. Davenport wrote Pletz in Munich. Personally, I am very glad that the Federation is now under the Leitung, that's German word for leadership, of a German. Fisher was willing to assume leadership of the Committee on Race Crossing, but who would pay the postage and printing costs? Davenport replied that the IFEO Treasury would, since it is more important to spend our money that way than almost any other. Davenport and Fisher co-authored a questionnaire to be sent worldwide to the persons living and working in foreign regions, physicians, missionaries, merchants, farmers, and travelers, asking them to send as detailed and significant data as possible. The questionnaires would be produced in English, Spanish, and German. Davenport and Fisher reported in a joint memo that the data would eventually identify not only race-crossed individuals, quote, but entirely foreign people, that is, the so-called colored ones. As the 30s opened, many key players in the American eugenics movement continued to support German raceology. In December 1929, the Rockefeller Foundation began a 5-year subsidy of Fisher's German National Anthropological Survey, with a donation totaling $125,000. Although the study was labeled anthropological, it was in fact racial, eugenic, and, in part, directed at German Jewry. German officials who supported the proposal for the study made this clear in a letter to the Foundation. They would not survey a large sample of people, quote, of an ancient type. Instead, they would select multiple smaller cross-sections of the general population, which would, quote, be examined in its genealogical and historical relationships with the help of church records, place, and family histories. In this way, it is hoped to find new solutions about the appearance of certain signs of degeneration, especially the distribution of hereditary pathological attributes. The letter continued. From the eugenic standpoint, questions will be submitted on the biological conditions of families, the number of births and abortions, succession and rates of birth, and finally questions on the decline of births and birth registration in the region being investigated. A determination of blood groups will also be undertaken. There is also planned an investigation of the Westphalian aristocracy, of the old established Jewish population of Frankfurt, and the so-called old lineage of some other towns. For certain eugenic discussions, it seemed of the greatest importance to obtain useful support for the question of pathological lines of heredity among the population. Rockefeller executives quickly approved the idea, channeling the money through the Emergency Fund for German Science. Rockefeller trustees authorized the grant in the midst of the devastating worldwide depression ignited by the stock market crash of 1929. As breadlines stretched across American cities, the economic crisis also crippled the German economy. German eugenicists needed all the financial assistance they could get. In August of 1930, Germany's Archiv für Rassen- und Gesellschaftsbiologie ran a tribute to Pletz on his 70th birthday. Among those extending kudos were Davenport and Popenoe on behalf of the United States. In October of 1930, Eugenical News called the edition a worthy tribute of esteem and affection for the genial and high-minded scholar whom it honors. In the same issue, An article entitled, quote, Jews in West Africa, reviewed a book claiming evidence of Jewish infiltration among the Maasai tribes of Africa as a result of a trek of Jews from Jerusalem to the Niger. The book was deemed, quote, a good example of the deductive method, so great as to make the book a very valuable contribution. The next news is congratulated J.F. Lehman, now openly Nazi, for being Germany's leading eugenic publisher. At about that time, the IFEO created a committee on racial psychiatry under Rudin's chairmanship. When I read the J.F. Lehman publishers, I can't help but think of the Lehman brothers and their banking and investment going back to the Civil War on the southern side, and wonder if there's a relationship. Spelled the same, Lehmann. In December of 1930, Eugenical News reprinted Rudin's long paper, Hereditary Transmission of Mental Diseases. In it, Rudin declared, humanity demands that we take care of all that are diseased, of the hereditarily diseased too. According to our best knowledge and power, it demands that we try to cure them from their personal illnesses, but there is no cure for the hereditary dispositions themselves. In its own interest, consequently, and with due respect to the laws of nature, humanity must not go so far as to permit a human being to transmit his diseased hereditary dispositions to his offspring. In other words, humanity itself calls out an energetic halt to the propagation of the bearer of diseased hereditary dispositions. Rudin advocated sterilization of all members of an unfit individual's extended family. It becomes clear, he argued, that in these cases, propagation ought to be renounced. For other degrees of relationship, for example, for the nephews and nieces, grandchildren, we must make the eugenic ideal a sacred tradition. It must be rooted so deeply in man and at the right time that the respect he owes it becomes a matter of course with him, and that he will find love without trespassing on the laws of eugenics. In 1931, Rockefeller approved an additional 10-year grant totaling $89,000 for Rudin's Institute for Psychiatry. This grant funded research by two doctors into the links between blood, neurology, and mental illness. It reflected a growing trend among some philanthropic foundations to avoid funding scientific organizations focused on eugenics, which in recent years had come under fire for being too political and too scientifically shoddy. Genetics, psychiatry, brain research, anthropology, and sociology were all preferable destinations for American biologic research dollars. One Rockefeller memo observed, race biology today suffers immensely from its mixture with political dogmas and drives. In that instance, the foundation had granted $90,000 to a eugenic geneticist who had studied at Cold Spring Harbor because they felt the recipient was worthy. Moreover, eugenicists were constantly seeking the carriers, the normal people who transmitted defective genes that might crop up once in several generations. Because of the bad publicity surrounding this idea and the growing belief that eugenics was more racism than science, the new breed of eugenicists began looking for blood identifiers that seemed ethically neutral. Even still, the searches remained race-specific. Hey, Professor Hamamoto, you're here. It's very nice to have you. Merry Christmas to you. Davenport was one of the founders of the American Sociological Association. You are not enjoying a Hungry Man TV dinner at the moment, Professor. Come on. Are you really? No, I don't believe you. Hey, we got to clean up our food, guys. It's part of the way they're shortening our lives. They're making it easy for us to to imbibe, to consume things that are going to come back to hurt us as we get older. Whether under the banner of psychiatry, anthropology, genetics, or race hygiene, American funding was still consciously promoting eugenic research. For example, in 1931, the Carnegie Institution contributed $5,000 for an International Genetics Congress, and the separate Carnegie Endowment added $3,500. Davenport also contacted the Rockefeller Foundation to enlist their support for this event. Also in 1931, the famous Bauer-Fischer-Lentz volume, Foundation of Human Heredity and Race Hygiene, was translated into English. One chapter was entitled Racial Psychology and cited a study demonstrating that, quote, the racial endowment of the Jews find expression in the nature of the offenses they commit, unquote. Another passage asserted that fraud and the use of insulting language really are commoner among Jews, adding, quote, it is said that Jews are especially responsible for the circulation of obscene books and pictures, and for carrying on the white slave trade. Most of the white slave traders are said to be Ashkenazic Jews, unquote. Another passage insisted, quote, the Jews could not get along without the Teutons. The term Jewish question, Judenfrage, was first used throughout this book, requiring no explanation. A 1931 review of the newly translated book in Eugenical News lauded the work and declared, quote, the section on methodology is especially valuable, adding that it was now the standard treatise on the topic. The review concluded, we welcome the English edition, which seems to have been well done. We bespeak for it a wide circulation. During 1931 and 1932, Hitler became an increasingly loud and pernicious voice for persecution, fascist repression, and warlike territorial occupation. In America, he was heard on radios, seen in newsreels, and read in newspapers. Virulent and very public anti-Semitism was sweeping across Germany. None of this caused American eugenic circles to pause in their support of German eugenics. In the March-April 11 edition of Eugenical News, the long essay, quote, Hitler and Racial Pride, heaped praise on the up-and-coming leader. One passage proclaimed, quote, the Aryans are the great founders of civilizations. The mixing of blood, the pollution of race, has been the sole reason why old civilizations have died out. The Hitlerite term Aryan was now becoming synonymous with the traditional Nordic. In another passage, the article cited an earlier New York Times report declaring, quote, the Hitlerites hold the Nordic race to be the finest flower on the tree of humanity. It must be bred according to the, quote, criteria of race hygiene and eugenics, unquote. On May 13, 1932, the Rockefeller Foundation in New York dispatched a radiogram to its Paris office. Quote, June meeting Executive Committee $9,000 over 3-year period to KWG Institute Anthropology for research on twins and effect on later generations of substances toxic for germ plasm. Nature of Studies requires assurance of AT, referring to Rockefeller's Director of Science in Europe, Augustus Trowbridge. At about that time, Fisher and other eugenicists were busy presenting drafts of compulsory sterilization laws to the Weimar authorities. During a committee meeting on the subject in the summer of 1932, Fisher shouted at the Nazi representative, "Your party has not been in existence nearly as long as our eugenic movement." One leading eugenicist at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Biology later bristled. The Nazis took over the whole draft, and they used the most inhumane and execrable methods to put the humane measures, which we had conscientiously and responsibly drafted, into everyday practice. The Third International Congress of Eugenics was held in New York in August of 1932, once again at the American Museum of Natural History. Although organizations such as the Rockefeller Foundation were donating vast sums to German eugenics for research and to travel, the grants were frequently limited to specific activities within Germany or neighboring countries. Hence, there was no money for the German delegation to travel to Manhattan. Nor did Carnegie make up the shortfall. Davenport apologized in a letter to Fisher. "Of course, the Depression at this time has interfered with our efforts to secure funds to help defray the expense of our foreign colleagues. We are very much disappointed that you and other friends from Europe may not be able to come to the United States and see the work going on there. We had hoped you would come and find your expenses paid by giving some lectures. But the German delegation did not come, and instead sent a few poster exhibits from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics." At the opening ceremonies, Davenport lamented the absence of the German delegation and lauded their leadership. The September-October Eugenical News carried another long article praising Hitler and his eugenic ideas. It also explained how ideology had been guided by such American authors as Lothrop Stoddard and Madison Grant. German elections were looming, and the article prophesied the results. The Hitler movement sooner or later promises to give him full power and will bring to the Nordic movement general recognition and promotion by the state. The article added, "When they, the Nazis, take over the government in Germany, in a short time there may be expected a new race hygiene laws and a conscious Nordic culture and foreign policy." Unquote. The next month, November of 1932, Germany held a fractious election. Hitler received 12 million votes, approximately a third, but no majority. A coalition government was out of the question because other parties refused to share power with Hitler, and vice versa. January 30th, 1933, as America awoke, swastikas flew above Berlin, Munich, Leipzig, and the other strongholds of Nazi agitation. Brown-shirted mobs marched through the streets in celebration, swaggered in beer halls, rode their bicycles in tandem, and joyously sang the Horst Wessel song. For years, the Nazis had promised that upon assuming power they would rebuild Germany's economy, dismantle its democracy, destroy the German Jewish community, and establish Aryans as the master race. On January 30th, 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg, exasperated with fruitless all-night attempts to create a governing coalition, finally exercised his emergency powers. Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler interim chancellor. The Third Reich was born. So, according to our author, the eugenics movement was the springboard from which the Nazis were able to secure political power by having the existing pseudoscience supported by American elitists and lots of money, and we should include the British through Carnegie, that the Nazi movement and the Third Reich itself owes its progeny to Cold Spring Harbor, Davenport, Madison Grant, Lothrop Stoddard, and then the Brits, the Malthus and Galton. This pseudoscience created the Third Reich. Well, I'm going to leave it here tonight. I think that's enough of this tragic story for me right now. I'm going to get back to our little Christmas tree and return to, the season. Take it easy a little bit tonight. Tomorrow I'll take the day off. Great to have Addie and George over this morning. I think Addie's going to be a terrific help for George, and I have plans for him myself, so we're going to keep Ads nice and busy. All right, guys, I don't know the answer to what's happening with our politics. I don't suppose anybody does, but I certainly do have faith that someday, all will be revealed.